Hi and welcome to the School Shorts podcast with me, Melissa Chan Green, journalist and mum of two with an interest in connecting parents with the latest research in learning. Or not learning, as the case may be this episode. Did you know that you can forget up to 80% of a lesson the very next day after you've been taught it? I've probably been told that in the past, but forgotten until now. What it means for our children, though, who are learning some really foundational skills, is they could be forgetting a lot of this stuff. So that's where review and retrieval strategies come in, and great teachers are already doing this in their classrooms. But our guest today is coach of educators, Nathaniel Swain, and he's got some great tips for mums and dads who want to help too. Thanks very much for joining me, Nathaniel. Lots of people, parents especially, are really keen to help their kids learn when they get home or kind of revise what has been happening in the classroom. How important is that in terms of the learning process?
So I think it's really important for parents to remember that primarily the school's job really is to ensure that their child's learning is on track. I think parents can do an amazing job of advocating and supporting, but it's a fine line to cross, because ideally, if things are working well, we don't rely just on the home environment for all this great learning to happen. Most of that is happening at school, and then students can sort of feel like when they get home, they can relax. So it's important to sort of try and keep that balance, that it's not like another school day begins once they come home. But for parents to make a useful contribution, it's to think about how they can reinforce or support the work that's happening already in the classroom, because that's primarily where that learning is going to happen. So little things like checking in with your child to see what they might actually be doing and to try and get updates from the teachers to get an idea of what's currently being taught. Some students are, and your child might be more forthcoming about what they're doing, or they might not be, depending on their age. So I think having a clear idea of some of the big picture ideas and big picture outcomes, and ensuring that things like those foundational skills are constantly being addressed. So those are the ones like reading and spelling, writing, those key ideas within mathematics and number fluency. Those sorts of things come up again and again in every single subject. And if parents can help their child to get on top of those challenges or on top of those skill needs, then that can make a big difference in the long term as well. Ideally, you set things up so that the school actually has a good plan and a system of support that is helping your child as well. It's not just you doing all of that extra work at home, because it's one way to challenge your relationship with your child if that's the case.
Yeah, totally. And you want them to be able to enjoy learning, right? So teachers have wonderful strategies to do that. And as parents, that's not always our strength.
That's right, yeah.
What is around in terms of research as to how much a child, or probably anybody, retains after a lesson? Do we know how much actually sticks in there?
So there's a very old effect that we have in the literature called the forgetting curve. This was established by Ebbinghaus back in the 19th century. He actually didn't do this experiment where he measured how long it took for him to forget different aspects of learning, but he didn't use real authentic learning experiences to do that. Instead, he did it with sort of arbitrary links of words, basically trying to control for some other positive learning effects, like if the student can relate what they're learning really well to their background knowledge, that it's obviously going to stick a lot easier. And that's another effect called meaningful learning theory, which helps explain that phenomenon. But the forgetting curve is still useful because it shows that if anything else, students will forget quite a bit of what we teach them, especially if we don't pay attention to how often that decay, if you like, sort of happens. So initially you might have 80% or 90% proficiency after one lesson, but then the next day or a few days later, you might have dropped down to 30% or 20% retention of all of that detail and all of that skill.
Wow.
So it's important.
You could forget up to 80% of it by the next day?
Depending on a few factors, like depending on whether the student's thinking about it anymore. But, if you think about a PD that you've gone to and you hear this great information, you're nodding your head, you might have done this for your own work, and you sort of say, oh, that's really interesting. If you don't think about that ever again, 90%, if not 95% of that content will just disappear. It's why we take notes and things.
Yeah, and really at the time you can think this is so interesting and I get it. And then the next day, because, I have been to workshops like that recently, the next day they go, okay, so just write down what you remember from yesterday. And I'm like, oh my goodness. Yeah, I at the time thought this is never going to leave my head, and it has.
Yes.
I don't know if that's just children as well, though.
Well, it could be, but the pruning sort of that happens in the brain when we go to sleep, and it happens again and again with every sleep cycle, means that we don't keep all of the possible connections that we might have made over time. We actively sort of trimming to make sure that only the things that are really important are the things that are remembered. So I think that can be disheartening for parents to hear sometimes that all of that great learning might be being lost. But it is why that if you do some light touch activities or light touch opportunities to even get students to just try and do a brain dump, so get your child to just write down what they remember about what they've learned on a particular day or, a few days in that week, then you've got a more greater likelihood that you'll help that child, your child, feel more successful. Ideally, though, it's happening at the start of each lesson in the school as well. It's not left to the parent to sort of do it alone.
I was just going to say, I don't think it's not necessarily something parents need to stress about, right? Because it's overreaching, into the way. And from what I understand, it's actually built into the new way of teaching, really, isn't it? This kind of
schools that are getting onto this will think about retrieval practice. That's getting students to practice recalling things from their long-term memory and seeing if they can make connections. And they'll also incorporate some spacing of learning. So that rather than learning one topic intensively or over a short period, they'll actually space that learning over a period of time and interleave it. So go back and forth between topics or skills so that students have a greater likelihood of retaining that information. So schools that are up with those things should be doing it.
That is quite a good lesson for older students as well in terms of thinking about revising for an exam, right? Because that forgetting curve then would suggest that just cramming straight before an exam is not a great idea. Studying something, then waiting, cramming just before, because the forgetting curve would suggest that the very next day you're likely to forget a lot of it again anyway.
And I think if we all think critically on some of those exams that we might have crammed for the night before, if we've done them as part of schooling or university, we probably can definitely say hand on heart we haven't retained a lot of that information, even though the day of the exam we probably had all of it fresh in our mind. So yes, that intense sort of cramming sort of model is not conducive to long-term retention because of the forgetting curve, but also because there isn't enough time to actively engage in retrieval practice between sessions. So being able to actually see if you remember by doing things like flashcards or brain dumps or, short activities where you're basically testing your knowledge. So when you go in those test conditions, being tested actually can strengthen your memory because you're forcing yourself to make connections that otherwise might be trimmed away. But just doing lots of practice tests the day before is going to be too intense a strategy. The other thing that people need to think about for their children if they're studying for exams is ideally you're not just reading over notes. When we read over our notes and sort of look through things that we've learnt before, or even reading key ideas or readings or watching videos, for example, we aren't actually engaging in any form of retrieval. We're just sort of recognizing things that we've seen. And it feels good. Like it feels like your child might say, oh yeah, I understand this. I remember this. So that recognition feels good, but it doesn't necessarily mean that any retrieval is happening and also doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes. So in experiments where there's been some initial learning, they separate the groups into those who are allowed to reread and those who are just asked to try and retrieve, so try and remember what they've been seen before without access to the material. The ones who've been asked to retrieve retain the learning for longer and make better connections. The ones who got to reread the material for longer had no greater benefit.
And they might have thought that they knew more because they were actually allowed to see the stuff again.
Yeah, they had it for longer. So intuitively, you'd think, oh, they were able to spend more time mastering it. But actually, the process of mastery doesn't always just look like rereading and revision. It's actually testing your memory and seeing if you can remember it, which will help you or your child remember key content.
Is the lesson then for those students who are studying for exams that perhaps on a regular basis check in and write some of that down, and then that's more likely to stick if rather than just doing a quick cram before the exam?
Definitely. So if you are studying, even if it's over a longer period, ideally, because you space out those study periods, but even if it is, you've only got a few days left, for example, that time is not well spent just rereading notes and watching things or listening to things. You ideally will try and actively retrieve things. So you'll have a heading or a topic and try and write down everything you remember about it. Or you'll have a practice question that will test whether you understand something, and you'll attempt that and then check your response without looking at your notes while you're attempting it. The other thing is like flashcards. Like, do you actually have definitions or are able to make connections between key ideas? Can you do that quickly and efficiently? The flashcard's designed to quickly tell you whether you've got the answer right, and then try again, put that flashcard that you got wrong into a pile for further testing, and the one that you got right you can take out of that circulation for efficiency reasons. And that, flashcards is a pretty old school strategy, but it is supported by that idea of retrieval practice.
What about for younger children who are like learning writing, for example, in a classroom, learning the shapes of letters and that sort of thing? How can you help support them in the retrieval of that kind of knowledge?
Yeah, so for early handwriting, when they're learning how to form letters, initially the initial practice will be really important. So helping them to trace over a model of the letter and to make sure that they have things like the stroke order and directionality correct is really important. If they form those habits of doing the B's starting from the bottom and then going up around, then it's going to be very hard for them to break that habit later. So that initial instruction is important. But in terms of mastery, it's not just about tracing or copying, although it can feel like, oh, they're really getting it. It's also about them being able to be asked to write a letter, say, write the letter that makes a B sound, or can you write a B for me? And it's going to be a little or a lowercase b. Then getting them to see if they can recall how to do it. That's really what's going to do it. And, young children shouldn't be expected to sit there for huge amounts of time of study periods, especially with their parents. You're trying to have some fun as well. But you can do these activities in very short bursts, make them enjoyable. You might just make it so that you're doing this for 1 or 2 minutes, for example, as part of your drawing. For example, let's draw a bee to represent the ball that we've just drawn a picture of, for example. And so it should be fun and enjoyable. And students should then have a chance to, that your child should be able to write and be able to write for fun as well. Even if they can't write much, they're actively retrieving some letters, and that process is actually really reinforcing as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good thing to remember, that if you're drawing a picture of something, that even just the first letter of that is kind of enough, right? Like
depending on what they're up to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
You mentioned earlier in our chat around context and kind of background knowledge and how that can help the learning process. Is it kind of trying to form links between something new a child is learning and something that they already know? Does that help cement, I don't know, some little connections in the brain or something?
Yeah, so there's this theorist called David Ojibel, and he has this theory called meaningful learning theory, and it's becoming more prominent in a lot of schools. So for parents, I think you might hear this idea of connecting to prior knowledge or making connections across the curriculum. So this is a theme that a lot of schools are going to be grappling with over the next few years. I think we've done this, in a lot of schools over the last 20 or 30 years, but maybe not as explicitly and maybe not as tangibly. We might have also thought that, I'll just throw the kids in the deep end and see what they can do, not really paying attention to, do all my students have the background knowledge or background skills in order to achieve this? But David Ojibel, the meaningful learning theory guy, he says that the biggest predictor of students' learning is what they already know and what they can already do. So if we can guarantee some of those things and ensure that students can, and your child can feel successful and can make an active connection to what they're learning about, and explicitly being shown that can be a big win, so that they're not having to guess what those connections might be. Then there's much more likelihood that information will click, it'll be retained, and that your child will feel like, I get what this is about. A lot of the time, and this is being brutally honest, students will sit in classes in primary and secondary settings and basically go, I don't get it, or I don't know what this is, or they might just say, I'm bored, for example. But the trick to not being bored is basically understanding the connection between what you've already done and what you're now learning, and seeing how they actually add more knowledge or add more understanding or insight into something new, or consolidate a skill that you didn't have before. So the job of teachers, and if you can help as a parent by helping talk through the connections across the curriculum, even just in a fun sort of way, those can really help students to sort of see, this is important for me to know, and I can actively connect to this. It relates to something I already learned.
And I don't envy teachers, because there's such a wide spectrum of experiences within their classroom, right? But especially in Australia and New Zealand, with lots of different cultural backgrounds as well. And so I think teachers do a wonderful job of trying to make children see themselves in the work. But I guess that is something really that parents can help with by really understanding their child and their likes and their experience, and being able to say, oh, well, this is just like when Uncle Johnny does this, or I don't know, when Uncle Johnny goes fishing, and let's talk about the fish here, or,
exactly.
They have a much
natural
closer knowledge of their kids. Yeah.
Exactly. And for some parents, that's going to be easier to make those connections than others. But if you have to think creatively to sort of, provide a bit of a context or provide some background to why a new form of learning or study is going to be important, then, try and search for that. So one of the disservices that parents can say is things like, I didn't ever really get history at school. Didn't make sense to me. And so although that might be true, we don't want our own school experiences necessarily to close off opportunities for our children to engage in that literature and that knowledge. So really, don't necessarily have that low expectation. Open up the possibility that your child might be really interested in something that you didn't understand. So as hard as that is, parents can do a lot by having that positivity around new learning, and saying that even, you might say, I was interested in history, but I did find it a little bit tricky sometimes. So even reframing it somewhat to say that, one thing I really enjoyed was X, for example, can ensure that there is that positivity and openness to learning when it might be hard or tough going to begin with, if you're filling in a lot of blanks, or if your child's got significant literacy or numeracy difficulties that make it hard for them to engage with other parts of the curriculum, because those skills are so paramount.
Is it the case that some kids will just need a lot more revision than others as well?
Yeah, so what we are dealing with is in schools, your child might have excellent working memory abilities and be able to hold lots of things in their mind at once. And some children have working memory abilities that are somewhat limited, which means that new learning is going to take longer to pass through that working memory into long-term memory. So as a result, some children will get 50% of what was presented because the other rest was sort of went over their head or didn't get retained. And in other classes, it might be, I've got 90% of what the teacher said, and I'm just looking for that later 10% later. If the teachers are doing their job really well, then they can make connections to that learning and ensure that everything that they're teaching does overlap with previous learning, and make sure that students aren't being left behind. But essentially, some students just need more opportunities to have that overlap and to show and to see the material multiple times. And a good intervention and support system within schools is designed to give students those additional doses, if you like, of that information, so that they've got a greater chance of connecting with it before the whole class has to move on.
Yeah, I mean, because the thing is, even as adults, right, some days you just have a good day and you're like, on form and you're remembering things, and other days you haven't had a good sleep. Your kids have been keeping you up all night.
That's right.
And you're just not going to remember stuff. So
and kids go to school often without enough sleep. And if you can do anything for your child, it's to improve the living environment for your child so that they are going to school feeling refreshed and ready to learn and haven't been up late on screens and things like that. That's probably the biggest gift you can give to your child, is to make it easy for them to pay attention and focus when they're at school as well.
Nathaniel, you're doing some work with teachers in New Zealand as well through Spelled. Can you just explain the work that you're doing, the knowledge that you're going to be sharing there?
Sure. So I'm really excited for my first trip to New Zealand. Actually, I've never come over before. So someone from Melbourne coming along to Auckland. Spelled NZ has given this great opportunity to work with educators from around New Zealand and to gather together to talk about reading, writing and numeracy difficulties and learning disabilities. I'm really trying to understand how teachers and educators can best cater for those neurodivergences in the classroom, but also in intervention settings as well. So I can't wait to connect with many talented New Zealand educators in that forum.
It's a huge topic as well, and certainly something that we will continue to cover in School Shorts. So I really appreciate your time. Do have a wonderful time in New Zealand, and thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. If that topic was helpful for you and you'd like to hear more, please do like and subscribe. It sends me that feedback. School Shorts is all about supporting busy parents who want their children to thrive. Follow on social at School Shorts NZ for fun ideas, helpful resources, and exclusive giveaways.